I paid $1 million for this cup of coffee, and it was worth every penny to never have to share a table with you again." The words didn't snarl or shout. They were delivered with a chilling, conversational calm that cut through the hushed, expensive air of the artisan café more effectively than any scream. They were meant not to start a scene, but to end a conversation that had never should have begun. Ava Harrington, née Jenkins, felt the words like a physical slap. The meticulously applied foundation on her cheeks seemed to crack. Her hand, elegantly clutching a spoon for her $12 matcha latte, froze mid-stir. The man sitting across from her, the source of the verbal dagger, didn't even look at her. His eyes were on the rain-streaked window, watching the sleek, silent cars glide down the wet London street, as if he'd merely commented on the weather. This man, Elias, was a ghost. Or rather, he was the man she had tried to turn into a ghost, to bury in the unmarked grave of her past. The man she had divorced 7 years ago because he was an anchor, and she was a sail desperate for a wealthier wind. The man she had once called her greatest mistake. And now he was a millionaire, a multi-millionaire, if the whispers were true. And he had just spent a sum of money that would have made her old self faint to buy a single cup of coffee at the table she had begged for 5 minutes at. "Elias," she breathed, the name a plea and an accusation all at once. "You don't mean that." Finally, he turned his gaze to her. His eyes, once full of a boyish warmth she had found endearing and then, later, pathetic, were now the color of cool slate. They held no warmth, no nostalgia, no flicker of the shared history that had spanned over a decade. They were the eyes of a man who assessed assets and liabilities, and she had long ago been categorized as the latter. "Every penny, Ava," he repeated, his voice even. He took a slow sip from the simple white porcelain cup. "The cafe needed a certain donation to permanently reserve this specific table for me. I found the price reasonable. It guarantees my privacy. A privacy you are currently infringing upon." She flinched. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The script, the beautiful fantasy she had nurtured for months since she'd first seen his name in the Financial Times, had him stumbling over his words, his old love for her flooding back, his arms opening to welcome her back to the life she was always meant to have. Her life, their life. She had practiced her apology in the mirror. The tears, genuine enough when summoned by thoughts of her own unhappiness, were ready to fall. She was going to be humble, yet radiant. Contrite, but so beautifully familiar that he wouldn't be able to resist. But this man, this wasn't her Elias. Her Elias wore worn-out corduroys and laughed too loud in quiet restaurants. Her Elias thought a successful weekend was building a bookshelf without splitting the wood. Her Elias looked at her as if she'd hung the moon. Even when she made it clear she found his orbit mundane. This man was tailored, sharp, and immovable. He was the rock she had once dismissed as a pebble, now polished into unbreakable diamond. I saw you," she stammered, her confidence, her entire carefully constructed persona, crumbling under the weight of his indifference. "I thought we could talk. For old time's sake." "The old times," Elias said, placing his cup down with a precise click, "were not, as I recall, particularly savory towards the end. My sack is better enjoyed without that particular vintage." The anger, then, began to simmer through the shock. How dare he? After everything she had endured? After the mistake she had made? "You're being cruel," she said, her voice hardening. "No," he corrected softly. "Cruelty is emotional. This is transactional. You requested a resource of mine, my time. I have declined the transaction. That is all. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting." He glanced at his watch, a sleek Patek Philippe that probably cost more than her current husband's car. It was a dismissal so final, so utterly humiliating, that Ava felt the hot prickle of true tears of fury behind her eyes. She stood up so quickly her chair scraped against the polished concrete floor, drawing a few discreet glances from other patrons. "You've changed," she hissed, grabbing her designer handbag, a gift from her husband, a man who was currently circling the drain of bankruptcy. Elias almost smiled. It was a thin, cold curve of the lips that didn't reach his eyes. "Finally," he said. "Took me long enough." He turned back to the window, his attention already a continent away from her. Ava Harrington, humiliated and seething, had no choice but to walk away, the echo of his $1,000,000 dismissal ringing in her ears. As she pushed through the heavy glass door into the damp London air, the past she had so carelessly discarded rushed back, not as a warm memory, but as a cold, clarifying wave. 7 years earlier. "It's not a want, Elias, it's a need. Can't you see that?" Ava's voice was shrill, frayed at the edges from a years-long weariness. She gestured around the cramped living room of their modest terraced house in Coventry. The wallpaper, which she had once thought charmingly vintage, now seemed to mock her with its faded floral pattern. "We need a bigger life. A real life. Sarah from the gym, her husband just bought them a villa in Portugal." "A villa? What do we have?" "A mortgage on a house that's falling apart and a car that makes a noise like a dying animal." Elias looked up from the coffee table, where he was meticulously sketching designs for a custom piece of furniture, a hope chest a client had commissioned. His hands were smudged with charcoal, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was in his own world, a world of wood grain and joinery, of creating something beautiful and lasting from raw, simple materials. It was a world Ava no longer had any patience for. "We have a home, Ava," he said, his voice calm, infuriatingly calm. "It's warm. It's dry. We have each other. The car just needs a new fan belt. I can fix it on Saturday." "There!" she exclaimed, pointing a trembling finger at him. "That's it. I can fix it on Saturday. That's your answer to everything. You fix things. You tinker. You dream about your little wood shop while the world is moving on. I don't want to fix things, Elias. I want new things. I want things that don't need fixing." She saw the hurt flash in his eyes, a quick, deep wound she was an expert at inflicting, but she was too far gone in her own frustration to care. The frustration of clipping coupons, of saying no to holidays with friends, of watching other women carry handbags that cost more than her monthly salary as a receptionist. She was beautiful. She was clever. And she was trapped in a life of beige mediocrity, with a man whose greatest ambition was to hand-make a dining table. "My work is starting to get noticed, Ava," he said, a note of pleading in his voice. He held up the sketch. "This commission is good money. Mr. Peterson says if he likes this, he has friends who will want pieces. This could be the start of something." "The start?" She laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "We're 32, Elias. When does the start become the arrive? How long do I have to wait? Another 5 years? 10? Until I'm old and wrinkled and my only consolation is a beautifully crafted hope chest to store my regrets in?" She began to pace, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "I'm tired of waiting for your potential. Potential doesn't pay for holidays. Potential doesn't get you invited to the right parties. Potential is just a fancy word for hasn't made it yet." Elias set down his charcoal. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment she saw the love in his eyes, a stubborn, resilient love that had survived years of her dissatisfaction. It made her angrier. Why couldn't he just get angry back? Why did he always have to be so understanding, so good? It only made her feel worse. "What are you saying, Ava?" he asked, his voice quiet. She stopped pacing and turned to face him. The words had been brewing for months, years. They tasted like poison and freedom. "I'm saying I can't do this anymore. I'm saying I want a divorce." The silence that followed was absolute. It swallowed the room whole. Elias didn't cry. He didn't shout. He simply seemed to deflate. The light in his eyes, that last stubborn ember, flickered and went out. He looked down at his hands, at the skilled, strong hands she had once loved, and nodded slowly. "Okay," he whispered, "if that's what you want." There was no fight left in him. She had extinguished it, and in that moment, a cold certainty settled in her stomach. She had been right. A real man, a successful man, would have fought for her. He would have roared and promised to change, to become the man she needed him to be. Elias's quiet acceptance was just proof of his weakness. The divorce was swift and uncomplicated. They had little to fight over. She took the small savings account. He took the house and the fledgling business he called Jenkins Joinery. She sold the furniture she deemed old and used the money for a deposit on a sleek city center apartment. She felt light, unburdened, free. Within 6 months, she had met Charles Harrington. Charles was everything Elias was not. He was 15 years her senior, with a distinguished touch of gray at his temples and a wardrobe of sharp, expensive suits. He was a partner in a property development firm. He drove a German sports car and talked of investments and portfolios. He found her beauty dazzling and her ambition refreshing. He was, in every sense of the word, an upgrade. He wooed her with dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, weekends in Paris, a necklace of flawless pearls that felt cold and wonderful against her skin. He represented the tangible, glossy proof that she had been right to leave. She had traded potential for actuality. They married in a lavish ceremony. She became Ava Harrington, the name sounding sophisticated and solid on her tongue. For a while, it was everything she had dreamed of. The big house, the fancy car, the holidays in the sun. She hosted dinner parties and played the part of the successful wife beautifully. But slowly, the gloss began to wear off. Charles's money came with strings of control. He criticized her friends, her spending, even her choice of perfume. The property market dipped, and Charles's smooth confidence turned to brittle anxiety. He began to make risky investments, desperate to maintain their lifestyle. They started to argue, their fights cold and strategic, devoid of the underlying love that had always underpinned even her fiercest rows with Elias. She began to notice things she'd chosen to ignore. Charles's laughter was too loud at parties, a performative boom. His compliments felt rehearsed. His love was conditional on her being a perfect accessory. The big house felt empty. The expensive car was just a mode of transport. The pearls felt like a collar. And through it all, in the quiet, lonely moments, a memory would surface. Elias, laughing as he burned their first dinner together in their tiny rented flat. Elias, holding her hand tightly in the hospital waiting room when they thought she might be seriously ill. Elias, working through the night to finish a project, his face smudged with sawdust, filled with a pure, quiet passion she had never understood and had ultimately mocked. A deep, unsettling regret began to take root, but she ruthlessly pruned it. She had made her choice. This was the life she wanted. Then, 3 years into her marriage to Charles, she saw the article. It was in a Sunday supplement magazine, left on a coffee table at a charity event she was attending with Charles, who was there to schmooze potential investors. She was bored, sipping lukewarm champagne, when her eye caught a familiar name. Elias Jenkins, the joiner who joined the jet set. Her heart stuttered. Beneath the headline was a photograph. It was him, but not him. His hair was shorter, styled. He was wearing a impeccably cut navy blazer and jeans. Not a suit, but he wore them with an effortless elegance that screamed of money. He was standing in a breathtaking, light-filled space, surrounded by sculptures of wood and light pieces of furniture that were no longer mere furniture, but works of art. The caption read, Elias Jenkins in his London studio, with his acclaimed Symphony in Oak console table, recently acquired by the V, a museum, for a reported 6-figure sum. The champagne flute nearly slipped from her fingers. She scanned the article with a racing heart. It detailed his meteoric rise, how a niche interior designer had discovered his work and featured it in a high-profile project, how his unique philosophy of listening to the wood had captivated a wealthy artistic clientele, how he wasn't just a craftsman, but an artist, creating one-of-a-kind pieces for celebrities, royalty, and museums. His wait list was years long. His pieces were investments. He was, the article gushed, a genius who had redefined modern craftsmanship. The magazine listed his net worth. It was an amount with so many zeros it made her feel physically ill. Charles, noticing her pallor, leaned over. "What is it, darling? You look like you've seen a ghost." She couldn't speak. She could only point a trembling finger at the photograph. Charles peered at it, then snorted dismissively. "Oh, him. Jenkins. Yeah, I heard. The guy makes very expensive tables. Lucky bastard." He took a sip of his drink. "Funny to think that could have been you. Stuck with a struggling carpenter. Dodged a bullet there, my dear." He wandered off to find a more important conversation, leaving Ava alone with the wreckage of her own choices. Stuck. The word echoed in her mind. She hadn't been stuck. She had been loved. Deeply, truly, and unconditionally. And she had thrown it away for a man who now called her "my dear," with the same affection he'd use for a waitress. The regret she had been suppressing erupted like a volcano. It consumed her. Every argument with Charles, every lonely night in her perfect house, every memory of Elias's quiet, steadfast love-it-all coalesced into a single agonizing truth. She had made the single greatest mistake of her life. She became obsessed. She devoured every article, every mention of him online. She learned he was unmarried, that he lived in a stunning penthouse overlooking the Thames, that he was photographed at gallery openings and charity galas, often with beautiful, intelligent-looking women on his arm, but never the same one twice. He was successful, celebrated, and heartbreakingly alone. A plan began to form in her mind. A desperate, crazy plan. Charles's finances were teetering on the brink. She could feel it. The arguments were constant. The end was inevitable. But if she could get to Elias, if she could make him see, if she could remind him of what they had, she would be humble, she would apologize, she would make him understand that she had been young and foolish, blinded by ambition. She would show him that the woman he loved was still there, buried under years of poor choices. He had loved her once, more than anyone ever had. That kind of love didn't just vanish, did it? It took her another 2 years to muster the courage and for her marriage to Charles to finally implode. The bankruptcy proceedings were ugly and public. The divorce was even uglier. A bitter fight over the scraps of a collapsed empire. She was left with almost nothing, except for a few pieces of jewelry she'd hidden away and a burning, desperate hope. Elias. She found out his habits, his favorite café, the table he liked, and she waited. For weeks, she went there, spending money she couldn't afford on drinks she didn't want, hoping to accidentally run into him. And then, today, it had happened. He walked in, alone, looking more handsome and assured than any photograph could capture. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, her second chance. She had approached him, her smile tremulous, her eyes glistening with rehearsed tears. "Elias, my God, it is you!" He had looked up, and for a fraction of a second, she saw surprise. Then, nothing. A blank, polite mask. "Ava, can I sit for a moment? It's so wonderful to see you." He had gestured to the empty chair, his expression unreadable. And she had launched into her speech, her voice soft and pleading. She talked about her mistakes, her regrets. She talked about the empty life she'd led without him. She didn't ask for anything, not directly. She just wanted him to know. She wanted him to see her vulnerability, her truth. He listened silently, not interrupting, not reacting. When she finished, breathless and hopeful, he had taken a slow sip of his coffee, and then he had spoken those 7 devastating words. "I paid $1 million for this cup of coffee." Back in her small, rented room, Ava stared at her reflection in the cheap mirror. The woman staring back was 39, but looked older. The expertly applied makeup from this morning was now a smudged mask, revealing the lines of disappointment around her eyes and mouth. The hope she had clung to for so long was gone, extinguished by the chilling indifference in Elias's voice. The full, crushing weight of her folly finally landed on her. It wasn't just that she had lost a rich man. It was that she had lost a good man. She had mistaken his quiet passion for weakness, his contentment for lack of ambition, his steadfast love for something common and easily replaceable. She had been the anchor, not him. She had been the one holding him back with her constant dissatisfaction, her nagging, her refusal to see the value in what he was creating, both in his workshop and in their life together. Her greed wasn't just for money. It was for a certain kind of validation, a status she thought would fill a hole inside her. It had only made the hole bigger. Her tears now were not for show. They were hot, shameful, and utterly real. They were for the beautiful, handcrafted hope chest of regrets she now owned, filled to the brim with every unkind word, every dismissive eye roll, every moment she had made the man who loved her feel small. She thought of Elias's eyes. There had been no hatred in them. That would have been easier to bear. Hatred is passion. It means you still matter. What she saw was nothing. A void. She had been erased. It was the most painful motivation she had ever experienced. The next few days were a blur of despair. But slowly, from the ashes of her humiliation, a new resolve began to form. She couldn't get Elias back. That door was closed, locked, and $1 million worth of coffee had been poured into its foundations. But she could stop being the woman who had driven him to buy that coffee. She had defined her life by the men in it. First, she was Elias's wife, and found him lacking. Then, she was Charles's wife, and found herself lacking. Now, she was nobody's wife. For the first time since she was a young girl, she was just Ava, and Ava was a mess. She found a job, not a glamorous one. It was as an office manager for a small accounting firm. The pay was mediocre, the work was dull, but it was hers. She rented a tiny flat, not in the trendy part of town, but in a neighborhood that was real and unpretentious. She bought her own food, paid her own bills. It was terrifying and exhausting, and for the first time in years, it felt honest. She stopped looking at society blogs. She canceled the subscriptions to the luxury magazines. She started reading again, for pleasure. She went for long walks. She learned to cook simple, nutritious meals for one. It was a quiet, small life, a life of mending, not spending. One Saturday, walking through a local market, she saw a stall selling handcrafted wooden toys. The simplicity and love in them reminded her painfully of Elias. The stall was run by a young couple, their faces bright with passion for their work. Ava felt a pang, not of envy for their success, but of recognition for their joy. She understood it now, that pride in creating something with your own hands. She bought a small carved bird. It was inexpensive, but she paid for it with money she had earned herself. It sat on her windowsill, a small, solid reminder of a value she was only now beginning to understand. Months turned into a year. The sharp pain of her encounter with Elias dulled into a permanent, low ache of regret, a wisdom earned at a terrible price. She heard through the grapevine that Charles had moved to Spain. She felt nothing. She also heard that Elias had established a foundation funding arts and crafts programs for underprivileged kids. The news made her smile, a sad, proud smile. Of course he had. One evening, leaving her office late, she passed the fancy café. She didn't even look inside. She kept walking, her head held high. She was not the same woman who had begged for a crumb of attention there. She was poorer, older, and infinitely richer. She didn't know it, but from the window of his million-pound table, Elias saw her. He watched her walk down the street, her stride purposeful, her gaze straight ahead. She looked tired, but there was a strength in her posture that he hadn't seen in years, not since the early days of their marriage, before the discontent had begun to hunch her shoulders. A faint, almost imperceptible sadness touched his eyes. He remembered the girl he had fallen in love with, the one who laughed with her whole body and dreamed out loud. He had paid a high price to forget the woman she became. He hoped, for her sake, that she had found some peace. He felt no desire to be part of her life again, but he also felt no hatred. He was free. He turned back to his sketches. He was working on a new piece, a complex design inspired by the resilience of ancient trees. He had learned that the most beautiful growth often comes from the deepest scars. The wood held its history, and in doing so, became stronger, more interesting, more valuable. He picked up his charcoal, his skilled hands ready to listen to the story the wood wanted to tell. Outside, Ava turned the corner and disappeared from view, both of them finally on their own paths, shaped by the past but no longer prisoners to it. The price of his coffee had been exorbitant, but the cost of her lesson had been everything. And in the end, they had both, finally, paid their dues.